When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be continuing my Dance with Dragons retrospective, and we're going to be doing part 4. So if you haven't seen the previous parts, I would highly recommend doing so, as just jumping in when I'm on chapter 42 of the book, kind of random. What are you doing? But still, in this part of the retrospective, this is where I think Dance really starts to hit its peaks. Now, we did see some really great chapters early on in Dance, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the POVs were kind of building towards things, and we were still kind of getting the ball rolling. This is where we're entering kind of the back, I would say, 2/5 of the book. There are some really good chapters. We start seeing more chapters from characters in Feast for Crows, getting some of their revelations and resolutions. Specifically, one we're going to talk about in this video, which I find very interesting, and I'm really glad we got more of, is Arya. I think Arya has her best chapters in this book, not even in Feast for Crows, which is kind of insane. But yeah, let's not waste any time. If you did want to listen to these on Spotify, I do usually put my longer videos on Spotify, so check that out if you want to listen to these kind of on the road and not on the YouTube platform. I will have that in the description as well, so look for that. But let's start off right away with chapter 42, Theon 5. And what can I say about Theon? I feel like I say this every time a Theon chapter is brought up. I think that almost any chapter by Theon could be somebody's favorite Theon chapter of the book, because they're all that good. Now, personally, I like the Theon chapters almost as they go, because each one builds upon the last, and you have just more tension and more of Theon or Reek trying to find the version of himself that is Theon and trying to become a better person and man and overcoming the psychological damage and physical damage done to him. I just think like this chapter, the next chapter, the chapter after are just fantastic. And so what do we get in Theon 5? It's Theon after the kind of the dreaded wedding chapter between Ramsay and Jane Poole, or fake Arya. And we see that Roose is kind of declaring the snows have come to wipe away Stannis. And this is before we actually get Asha's first chapter with Stannis's march to Winterfell. So this is kind of a revelation to us as an audience to kind of prelude what we're going to see with Asha in the next chapter. But it's interesting because you see that there's this sense of security, right, that it seems like Roose's camp has. But slowly as this chapter goes on, it seems to kind of slowly dissipate to where even the side that, is on the defensive, they're in Winterfell, the atmosphere is filled with tension. Theon himself gets approached by some interesting figures in this chapter. One of them being one of Mance's spearwives, wanting to know how he got into Winterfell so easily, which we know will have repercussions later on in the book. But for now, Theon kind of shrugs it off. Theon himself prefers to kind of wander the castles. He's kind of this ghost in Winterfell. He's this person reminiscing about his youth and all of the decisions she's made that's now led to Winterfell being in the state that it's in right now. And so it's so great because not only are we forwarding the plot and the Northern plot, which is by far the best plot of the book, it's forwarding Theon's growth, reminding him who he needs to be. And we get a lot of him thinking about, his psychological damage with Ramsay, because it's brought to the front with how he thinks about Jane, right? Jane is going through the same things, very similar to what Theon was going through, and he sympathizes with her. He even thinks about how he had planned, or at least thought of, trying to escape. And that's interesting as well, because he's actually going to do that by the end of this book. But it shows that Theon slowly through each chapter is becoming more and more part of maybe this new version of himself. I won't say the old version, because the old version of Theon, this isn't that, right? He's becoming a better version of himself and trying to atone for some of the things that he did. He even pleads with the old gods, something that Theon in his younger years never would have done. I just did Theon 1, A Clash of Kings, Theon's first POV in the entire story. And even when he talks to his uncle Aeron, he isn't somebody that prays to any gods, not even the drowned god either of the Ironborn. And so when you get to this point of the story and you see that he's been so broken that he's turning to the old gods of the Starks, it has a really interesting revelation, because when we get to the Barbary Dustin part of this chapter, you kind of understand why he almost goes to the old gods. And you also would think that the drowned gods have never done anything for Theon. If anything, him being an Ironborn has only worked against him and the decisions that he's had to make to try and try and prove himself to his father. And so as we see Theon kind of wandering his way back, he is actually run into by Lady Dustin, who also asks something of him, reminding him of his past. Whereas the Spearwives had asked how he'd taken Winterfell, Lady Dustin only wants to look at the crypts, which is interesting considering the past, right? Theon never thought to look to the crypts for Bran and Rickon, but that's where they were the whole time. And there's even these subtle nods that we see swords missing, especially Brandon's. And it's interesting because you take a pairing of Lady Dustin and Theon, and they're quite similar characters in a lot of ways. Both of them kind of even stating to each other that they both wanted to be Starks, right? And that's that great revelation where you understand Theon, where he's very similar to Jon. I talked about this in his first chapter as well, is that Theon and Jon share a lot of similarities, even though they have very different personality traits. And so when you have all this happening, and especially in the crypts with this eerie vibe hanging over them, and you even get Lady Dustin's background and her bitterly talking about, her past, I just love everything that we get in this chapter. It's one of my favorites of the book. It's not going to be, like my favorite or anything. There's going to be better chapters in this book overall. I do have this chapter within like my top 20 of the book. I've already ranked all of the chapters and I've kind of gotten through most of my notes already. But I do think really strong chapter from Theon. And again, I pretty much say this for every Theon chapter. I could definitely understand if this is your favorite chapter. But number 43, and I gotta say, George was cooking when he started, giving us these chapters, like chapter 42, which is Theon 5, 43 being Asha 2, and even when we get to Jon 9, which is chapter 45, and even chapter 46, which is Arya 1, a really good string of chapters. But Arya 2 is our first chapter with her with Stannis, and so we see how this long journey is going to be from going from Deepwood Motte to Winterfell. It's not really even that long. It's only a 15 days journey is what they say when they leave, but we know that's not going to go well, right? We hear it from Roos's POV that the snows are going to start. So this is kind of going a little bit in the past and then catching up to where we're going to be where we're going to be at with Theon's plot line for the most part. But the way I described this chapter in my notes was it kind of feels like if you guys have ever played the Oregon Trail like game that you can play on the web browser, or you even know anything about the Oregon Trail, it feels like that, but gone very wrong, right? The temperature is going against you. Men are dying. Your horses are dying. Everything is going wrong. And the start of the journey starts, pretty fine. It has Asha being chained in a baggage train with Alysanne Mormont to give her company, which not great company. You can understand why the two wouldn't like each other. Bear Island being kind of an island nation on the west side of the north. The Ironborn would probably raid them. You can see that there be definitely divides between the two households, but we also see that she finds kind of a good companion, Justin Massey, or at least somebody that's easy to talk to and entertaining to, even though Justin Massey probably isn't talking to her for the right reasons, given her claim and all those things, but she kind of just endures it. And I personally love Asha. I like her personality. I love her POVs. It really helps that you put one of my favorite POVs going into the next book in probably my favorite storyline of this book. It just creates this beautiful storyline that goes horribly wrong for Stannis, because as the journey starts to turn, the northern storms begin, and these men of the south, they are definitely not prepared for it. Asha herself is even brought before Stannis, but she messes up talking to Stannis as she mentions Robert, because she's like, well, we could turn foes into friends, and that whole idea, which Robert was great at, Stannis has never been good at, it basically ends her meeting with Stannis, and it doesn't go particularly well. But they continue for 30 days, Stannis not allowing them to stop until they reach a crofter's village. Asha realizes the march has basically destroyed them. They've lost all of their mounts, basically. They're running low on food. Again, if you're thinking you're going to have a 15-day march and then it ends up being 30 days and you can't really forage all that much to get extra food to resupply yourselves, it's not going to go particularly well. Morale is low, supplies are low, and they themselves seem to basically be getting thinned and aged. Asha notes that Stannis looks like a hollow version of himself, as he seems thinner and aged, like I talked about. But overall, the quality of this Asha chapter is just fantastic. And I talked about this, and this is kind of my frustration with Dance, is if all of the plot lines in the book had the same quality that the Northern plot does, this would probably be the best book of the entire series. But unfortunately, you have to balance the North plot line with things like the Essos plot lines. And that's kind of where I feel like this book kind of gets a little bit stuck in the mud. But that'll get us to chapter 44. And mentioning Essos, we have Dany 7, chapter number 44. Now, this is a weird chapter to me because I don't particularly rate it that high in terms of Dany's chapters, but I did note I'm happy that this particular chapter was a Dany chapter, because this chapter, the thing that it's the most known for, the thing that has the most amount of, like, you're going to remember it, is going to be this is when Quentyn and Daenerys meet. Now, I love that this interaction comes from Daenerys. Personally, I hate Quentyn. I think he is just a bad POV. I would go as far as saying he's probably the worst POV of the entire series, given that he has multiple chapters and they're all pretty bad in my opinion, outside of maybe his last one. I think his last chapter where, you know, he dies in. Yes, he does basically die in that chapter. Is his only one of note in my opinion. But before we get to the Quentyn stuff, we do see some other stuff before then. We see her abed with Daario as she is having doubts about her wedding, as she's kind of feeling boxed in as they are besieged. And Daario tells her to marry him, even though he knows she cannot. Out of all the stuff we get with Daario and Daenerys in this book, I do like this interaction between the two because it does show Daenerys not being able to get the things that she wants as a queen, having to put her people first, and some of the more interesting parts of Daenerys' actual plotline. We don't get a ton of that in this because it's almost completely filled with just the romantic interests of Daenerys. And unfortunately, I don't really like a lot of the romance stuff, whether it's with Hizdahr, whether it's with Daario, whether it's with Quentyn, whether it's with, you know, whoever. I find that to be the weaker stuff in Daenerys' plotline in this book. But I will say, when we do get to when Daario introduced the recruits, aka Quentyn's party, to Dany, I find this interaction to be so funny because it's Daenerys like looking at this Prince of Dorne and just going, not attractive. She compares him to a frog because that's what he's kind of named, and she recalls a story, right, where the frog will turn into a great prince, or, you know, it's kind of this twist on basically our own story where the frog would turn into a princess and all that stuff. And yeah, she's basically saying, Quentyn, you're ugly, why don't you turn good looking? And it's like, man, Daenerys, that's kind of some wild stuff in there. But honestly, because of how bad Quentyn is in this book, I completely love Daenerys in this moment. And I think it's just so funny because, you know, you look at Quentyn, and I think he's not the best written character. I think he's a character that has a lot of plot conveniences. And you just have Quentyn rocking up like, yeah, you know, we're supposed to marry because of this contract, which does not involve me or you in it. But it is a major, like, reveal, right? The fact that we get this idea that there was this marriage contract that Oberyn and the Sea Lord of Braavos looked over, that was a marriage pact basically between Arianne and Viserys. It is interesting, right? That would seem to kind of confirm that the Red Door was in Braavos and was probably the Sea Lord of Braavos' you know, house. Now, people still debate that to this day. I feel like, to me, this is kind of the proof you need, but I don't know. Some people will disagree with that, but I think it's either way, it's still a massive reveal for Daenerys specifically. But it's just Daenerys going, okay, but Quentyn, you don't have much to offer here. There's no swords that can help benefit me here as well. I'm already going to be getting married to Hizdahr. I already have, not only do I already have somebody I'm going to marry, I already have somebody that I'm sleeping with. So, like, Quentyn offers literally no value to Daenerys right now at all. Like, at all. And I just think it's so funny the way Daenerys puts Quentyn down. You know, she tries to do it in a nice way, but, you know, us knowing her thoughts is what makes this interaction hilarious to me. If we would have gotten Quentyn's side of this, it would not have been as interesting in my opinion. But, like, to me, this is why I really don't think that we needed Quentyn as a POV, because Quentyn kind of recounts everything that they did to get here to Daenerys and, like, Daario here. So it's like, why did we need those chapters to begin with. And also, all it's leading up to is, okay, Daenerys is going to deny him. He's going to do something foolish and die. So the only real reason I can see why we needed Quentin as a POV was because George wanted to make him a character that we cared about when he died. And it's like, didn't care about him in the beginning, so I'm not going to care about him when he dies. So, I don't know. But still, I do think that this chapter is interesting because it also does push the idea of Quaith's prophecy. Like, Daenerys believes it even more now because she was right about the sun's son coming, more or less. And so I do find that it's a enjoyable chapter, but it's not one of the better Daenerys chapters whatsoever. It lacks, I think, the really interesting parts of Daenerys and how she has to be a queen and ruling, the decisions she has to make, and a lot of the things that I find enjoyable about Daenerys' arc are just not present here. It's kind of dealing once again with the romance side of Daenerys' arc, which in my opinion is already bloated and too full already, especially when you think about Victarion kind of entering into this Daenerys lovers arena as well. I just don't really enjoy the overcrowded romance plot lines, but I don't think it's a terrible chapter by any means. That leads us to number 45, Jon 9. So in the last video, I think Jon was very underwhelming. I think a lot of chapters leading up to the kind of the end game for Jon, they are just building block chapters. They're very middle of the road chapters, but this is where I think Jon starts to really start to get good. Again, right? Because I think Jon is very good at the beginning. I think he's very good at the end. I think in the middle is kind of where he takes a bit of a slowdown as we're rebuilding into the other parts of his arc. And I really like what we get to see here, right? Because we see the Queen's party coming to Castle Black before they go on to the Night's Fort. We see the tensions right off the bat between the two sides because Jon's doing a lot of things that maybe the Queen wouldn't like. There's just that built-in tension there, right? With people in the Queen's men who also are not the most friendly to Jon and are even antagonistic, like Axel Florent is kind of towards the end of this chapter. It's just building up the lack of support Jon has, right? Not only is he losing the support of the Night's Watch, he also doesn't really have the support of Stannis's, I guess, men, even though it's really Melisandre's men. You see all that playing out, and so I find that to be really fascinating. But the other part of this that is even more interesting is a member from the Iron Bank actually ends up arriving here as well, which is great because it kind of fulfills Cersei's arc, right, in Feast for Crows, where she's not willing to pay back the Iron Bank or any of those things. She very much dismisses them, and so the Iron Bank are going to try and place their bets on Stannis. But Jon takes the opportunity to try and get loans, use their ships for Hardhome, and it's great because you understand, we as an audience understand what Jon's doing because we're in his head. Right? He's trying to find a way that they're going to have enough food to survive winter. And so how do you do that, right? You're going to have to take loans. You're going to have to try and trade with other people and getting food and all those things. But the problem is going to be you're going to take out loans that the Night's Watch isn't going to be able to pay back. They don't earn a lot of money. They don't have resources that they can give away for money. It's very much placing the Watch in a very, very difficult position because, yes, if he doesn't pay the loans, many of them are going to die in the winter. But if he does take these loans, afterwards, they're going to be in deep, deep debt, and who knows what the Iron Bank's going to do to get their money back. So you have this issue that you can see is kind of a lose-lose situation, in my opinion, but Jon is right. Like, this at least buys them time to get through winter. But he doesn't explain any of this to anyone. He doesn't take any counsel from anyone, see what maybe other people think about his decision and what they should do with the Iron Bank. Jon acts completely alone. Like he's done all throughout this book. He completely isolates himself because he's not willing to, have counsel with other people and see differing viewpoints and be able to communicate why he believes those things maybe aren't the correct way of doing things. And so I love this chapter because it exemplifies all those things. Because now that, if you're somebody else, if you're in the Night's Watch and you're sitting here going, this is all you're hearing, is that Jon took major loans from the Iron Bank, you're thinking, what is he doing? You don't understand his rationale because he doesn't explain it to anybody. He keeps it to himself, and those are the things that's going to get people to turn on him. Even though these are people that maybe loved him or wanted him to be the Lord Commander, it's all these different things that you have working in tandem. We're going to see the wildling plot really kick off, after this chapter specifically. You're going to have him kind of meddling in northern politics with the Karstark situation. You're going to have him taking loans. You're going to have him sending away his, closest allies and friends. You're going to have him doing all these different things that just add up. And this is just one of those things that I find to be very interesting because it is the Iron Bank and we don't really get to see them all that much. And so eventually they do settle on terms, but we do see as the tension begins to go up again because Jon talks with Axel Florent about Val, which they both know he doesn't have, and later he is woken up to find a girl on a dying horse has arrived. And Jon thinks about Arya, what he can do with her, so maybe sending her to Essos to be, harbored by somebody over there, sending him back with the Iron Bank, all of those things, until he realizes it isn't Arya Stark at all. And he seems to recognize the girl, but he can't place it at first. But when we get the reveal that it is Alice Karstark, it changes everything. Because on one hand, we find out that Stannis is being played as a fool by the Karstarks. And two, we get to see this kind of interesting relationship between Jon and Alice, because the two have very good chemistry. The two seem like if things had gone differently, maybe they would have been the ones, getting married, right? The two have really good banter, and just not only just this chapter, but the next chapter. It's interesting because Jon has such great relationships, in my opinion, with both Alice and Val, that it is kind of crazy. Jon's definitely got some women that I think like him a lot, but yeah. But it kind of does the next part of it, right? It kind of does this next, okay, now Jon is actually going to get involved in some of the northern politics. As much as he wants to say that he's out of those things, he is getting involved with it, right? He's getting involved with Stannis more and trying to help him. He's getting more involved with the Karstark situation, who Alice is eventually going to marry. All of that is very crucial in my opinion, and I really do think this chapter is great because it kind of takes it into the last stretch of the book and sets up all those things really, really well. That gets us to chapter 46, Arya 1. And so this chapter, in my opinion, is kind of the quintessential chapter for when I was younger and my first, reread or two of the books. I had Dance Above Feast for Crows. I think if you go back to my earliest, rankings of the books on this channel, I might say Dance Above Feast. I don't think my opinion on Feast for Crows really changed until I did the retrospective, and that's when I think I changed on that opinion. But this was a chapter where it kind of, this and the next Arya chapter really complete Arya's kind of journey from both Feast for Crows and Dance. And this is kind of why I think Feast for Crows at times, it gets kind of almost outdone by Dance, because Dance gets a lot of the conclusions to those characters that should have probably been in Feast for Crows. But because George is trying to keep the timeline somewhat coherent, because you have the POVs of one book and the POVs of another book, you have situations like this where you only see maybe one or two Arya chapters, or, one or two Cersei chapters or things like that. But I really love this Arya chapter. I do think both of her chapters in this book are better than all three of her chapters in Feast for Crows. But we see when we catch up with her that some time has passed as she has become blind Beth. She continues to have dreams of Nymeria, and that's actually the very open to this chapter, is her dreaming of Nymeria and being able to, see and all those things. But we see that because she's become blind, she's having more heightened senses, right? Counting the steps and touching and smelling and hearing, all those things become very much enhanced. And those things actually also seem to enhance her warging powers. And I almost find it interesting that maybe the Faceless Men know that, and they're using that, right? They're particularly trying to open up those abilities because they'd be very useful for a Faceless Man. It seems like they know that, which is also interesting because this chapter really starts to really delve into the magical elements of the Faceless Men. I'd say the next chapter way more than this one. But it's those things that I think we're lacking in A Feast for Crows from taking Arya to being some of the best chapters of that book, is because we were still introducing the Faceless Men. We were still introducing Arya into this plot line. This is where we start to get some of those payoffs. And I find that really interesting. And so basically what the Kindly Man and the Faceless Men are trying to do is they're trying to mold her, right? They're trying to get her to get rid of the Arya side of her, to not kill like she did with Daeron, and especially in the next chapter, not questioning who she's being told to kill, right? It's not about the reasoning of why you're killing them. It's just they need to die. The God of Death is requiring that person's death. And so that's what they're trying to instill in here. And we do learn a couple interesting things, as Arya is basically being sent out as Blind Beth to find new informations. We do find that one of the ships that had been carrying wildlings from Hardhome was caught by the Sea Lord of Bravos as they were trying to sell the wildlings as slaves, which is interesting. Nice little tidbit showing what was kind of going on with that plot line with Hardhome before it's going to get really bad. But when she returns to the temple, we also get another revelation. She learned to see through the cat to figure out that the kindly one was the one who had been hitting her earlier in the day. She says that's one of the things she's found out. And I don't mean that she tells the kindly man that, but she figures it out. And that's what we know in her head. But it's interesting because it shows us that Arya is learning to warg things outside of just Nymeria. Something that we haven't seen, any real characters outside of like Bran be able to do. Just shows you, and this is something that the show completely didn't do, is going into more of the magical powers of the Stark kids. And I find that very, very compelling in this as we go forward into it. We also see things in this chapter like how hard it was to continue, being this blind girl. At so many times she thought about, leaving the temple because they would tell her, if she wants her vision back, all she has to do is say so and they'll give her eyes back, but then she'll be forced to leave. And so I really love that element of the story. It has tension to it. It has unease. It has a magical element and feel to it. But she eventually does get her sight, seeing a candle in front of her. Again, I love the chapter. I think it's a pretty good one. I don't think it's like in my top chapters of the book or anything. I think Arya 2, which we will get, is in my top 10 of the book. But Arya 1 is definitely, I'd say, an above average chapter in this book. I have it ranked on my chapter rankings at 30, and there's a possible 73 chapters in this book. So top 30, pretty solid. Both of her chapters are in my top 30, with Arya 2 eventually going to be in my top 10. But yeah, so that'll get us into chapter 47, Theon 6. So like I've said, for pretty much every single Theon chapter, all of them could be your favorite, and that doesn't change with Theon 6. I personally have Theon 6 as the best chapter of the first 6 for Theon. Again, I talked about a lot for me. As each Theon chapter we get, I think each one builds upon and gets better. We're going to talk about Theon 7 as well in this video, which will be his last chapter. And to me, it's his best chapter, and I'll talk about why that is when we get there. But again, it builds off of what we got in the last chapter. Where the last chapter was, we kind of start at Winterfell, and there's this sense of security, safety, and as the chapter goes on, the tension builds more. The weather starts getting worse. People are starting to kind of feel the effects, especially, the Freys, for instance, because they're from the south. And so this chapter takes what was just alluding towards that tension and has it kind of explode. We see a number of different things happen. Firstly, we see slowly as there are multiple murders occurring, each more unsettling than the last. And these are still up for debate. Some maybe being the Spearwives, some maybe being this hooded man that Theon sees, even another one of those being one of the Walders. So there's a lot kind of going on here. But we do see Yellow Dick being one of Ramsay's companions is brutally killed. This with the fact that they are wary of Stannis attacking at any point. The tension comes to a boiling point as the lords begin to turn on each other, only being stopped by Lady Dustin and Lord Ryswell. But my favorite little moment of this chapter, in my opinion, is when Theon, who's watching all of this stuff going on, he sees almost a rare slight of fear in Roos's eyes. Roose is kind of seeing his army is splitting, and he already is suspicious of many of the lords here, especially Lord Manderley. This is going to make it even more further. When people are going disappearing and people are dying randomly, it's not a coincidence. There's sabotage being done. But Theon is later questioned. Theon was basically seen in the whereabouts. He's always wandering the castle, so he is a suspect, but he's basically swiftly dismissed due to his condition. Again, he's not strong enough to be killing people very easily or overpowering people to begin with. And so Theon goes to the Weirwoods in the Godswood to pray when he hears a horn. And presumably this is meant to announce Stannis. It's not really. It's Moore's Umber, but everybody else doesn't know that. They believe that this is Stannis and that he's finally arrived at Winterfell. Again, the tension builds because already inside of the castle, they're not doing well. But now outside of the castle, you have a force that has made it to Winterfell. All the while, Theon seems to be, praying. He starts to hear his name. It seems to be whispering Theon, but it also seems to be Bran. Theon kind of sees Bran in the tree, and it seems to be maybe his voice. All of this is very interesting given what we know about Bran at this point of the story, and we haven't seen a Bran POV in actually a very long time now at this point. And so this is all very interesting and speculation that can Bran, talk to other characters through the trees, and it seems to be the case. We'll see how that affects the story going forward. But at the last part of this, he is set upon by 3 of the washerwomen who need his help. And we know this is going to be to try and get Jane Poole, who they believe is Arya Stark, out of Winterfell and getting her to Jon, or it's going to end up being Stannis, but that is what they're trying to do. And so we'll see how that plot line kind of ends with Theon 7. But to me personally, really great chapter, because there's a lot of mystery and intrigue that we are still kind of thinking about even in our theories today about how Winds of Winter is going to wrap them up, especially with a lot of the killings, the hooded man, for instance, the Mance stuff, how that's all going to play out with the Pink Letter. A lot of intrigue here, and it kind of builds into the finale for Theon as a character in POV. Chapter number 48 we have is Tyrion 10. Now, I noted in my notes the Tyrion 10 of a lot of the chapters we've gotten post Young Griff. I would say this is probably one of the better ones. I still don't think it's like a great chapter or anything, because I have most of Tyrion's chapters, or I'd say not most, but I'd say all of the ones kind of post Young Griff are really they're probably like in that bottom 15 to 20 chapters. This one would just be on kind of like that higher end, I would say. And so when I look at this chapter, it's the reason that I think it's a bit better than some of the past chapters is we actually get to see Tyrion being an interesting POV. What made him interesting in the past, right? Him being able to outsmart situations or outthink things. And so we see him being sold into slavery, and we're also able to see him kind of seeing what people are interested in him, and even recognizing this Brown Ben Plum character who he asks about later and has an interaction with at the end of this chapter. But you also see him manipulating getting Jorah to be part of their act. And so you have a lot of stuff that's really interesting, because you see Tyrion being in an element where he can use the things that make him so interesting to read. And so that part of it is interesting. And also you have this actual idea of, okay, we've never actually really seen a POV who's, being a slave. We've seen Daenerys being a POV where she is someone that is freeing slaves, but she's not herself a slave necessarily. And so we do get to see this side of it that, showing that slavery, how bad it is. And so part of that is interesting. I just don't feel like it's that necessary, given the fact that we do have such a big focus on it from Daenerys and really the last 2 books, that I feel like, yes, I don't mind it. And I actually do find that to be interesting with Tyrion. I almost don't feel like we need it, because of all the plot lines at this point of the story, it's the weakest. I don't know how I feel about it. And so Tyrion, to me, is like, I can understand why George made the chapter, and it is a chapter that needs to, I guess, be told. But I do feel like, especially this plot line going forward, a lot of it almost isn't really needed. You could really tell this through maybe one Tyrion chapter, instead of having a number of more Tyrion chapters left. We're not even close to the end of his plot line, really. And so I like it, but I don't like it at the same time. And so we do see, as Tyrion and Penny have to do their show for the slavers, and they're serving wine, and eventually we see Tyrion playing Savas against Brown Ben Plum, which is quite interesting. I think it's probably my favorite part of the chapter, and part of it is because I actually really like the character of Brown Ben Plum, and I just enjoy when we get to see him more. And that's going to be something that's even more apparent when we get to Daenerys' next chapter. I like seeing her conversation with him. But again, it's definitely a chapter that's a step up from the quality of the Tyrion chapters in the last couple, but it's still kind of in terms of the storylines that we already have right now. Like, I'd rather read a plot line about the North. I'd rather read some of these other POVs we're getting from Dance. I'd rather read, Dany, if we're just talking about the Marine plot at this point. So yeah, I don't know, kind of a mixed chapter to me for Tyrion 10. Number 49, another big surprise. We see another character from Feast for Crows getting 1 chapter. This is the only chapter Jaime gets in Dance with Dragons, and I honestly think George has some big balls for this. Given that Jaime is the best POV of A Feast for Crows, and could be argued is the best POV of A Storm of Swords, that's not my take, but some people do think that, and so I can't really fault you for that. But you give us 1 chapter here, and what we do get is fantastic. It's not Jaime's best chapter. I think he has better chapters than A Feast for Crows. but I do think it's a really strong one. It's a really good chapter. None of Jaime's chapters are bad in Feast for Crows. He was always consistently having all of his chapters ranked in the top half of Feast for Crows. But to me, what we get with this chapter is we're seeing this siege that's being done on the Blackwoods by the Brackens. It's Jaime arriving and kind of settling the conflict because the war really is over. I mean, at this time, Riverrun has fallen. There doesn't really look like any chance that the Lannisters are going to be taken down at this point. We know it's probably going to happen at some point, but at this time, it feels like the war is over. So the Blackwoods need to be dealt with, and the Brackens have already bent the knee rather quickly, Jaime kind of notes. And so it's Jaime having to deal with the two families. This chapter is almost completely about the Blackwood and Bracken conflict. We get a lot of our history about what actually maybe occurred in the past with both houses. And the moral of the story here is, you have two families that hate each other generationally, right? And it almost feels like for no reason. Neither one of the histories are really recorded that well. They could be blurred together. We really don't know what the true history of the Blackwoods and Brackens are. So these two sides could be fighting over, petty things that happened in the past, and that creates more issues, right? You think about characters like Bloodraven and Bittersteel. Those characters hate each other because of some things that did happen during that time, but also a lot of their hatred was built upon things that happened generations and generations ago. And so it's this pointless conflict in a lot of ways. It's George writing about this pointless conflict that leads to violence continually. And so I find that aspect of this to be really interesting. It's also kind of interesting to see how Jaime deals with Lord Blackwood, somebody that has been in the story really since book 1. It's interesting to see how he deals with him and also dealing with Lord Bracken as well. Really awesome to see how Jaime works through all those things. But then he leaves us on a massive cliffhanger. And I mean a massive cliffhanger. I think of all of the storylines that ends in this book, this is the one that you're almost like, wow. It's kind of surprising George didn't give us more here, especially what we know with A Feast for Crows, right? Where Brienne's storyline ends there, and with Lady Stoneheart, we see Brienne, pop up here with Jaime, and that's just how it ends, right? The two are going to go off alone and all of that. And it's a really great cliffhanger because, you really want to see more of it, but at the same time, it's like, man, I could not imagine reading A Dance with Dragons when it first came out, and now you've waited, however many years, and we still have not gotten any answers to that at all. Yeah, great chapter by Jaime, of course. But yeah, it's very, very ballsy, in my opinion, that George gave us one chapter of Jaime, and then we do not see him for the rest of the book. He does that a lot with his POVs in this book. For instance, Bran, Davos, two of my favorite POVs in the first half of the book, they disappear. Jaime pops up once, second half of the book, don't see him again. So he does that quite a lot with a lot of the POVs in the book. But yeah, great chapter by Jaime. Let's move on to number 50, Jon 10. So Jon 10 builds off of what we got in Jon 9, where we're seeing the fallout of the Karstark plotline. We see Alice Karstark and Sigorn, who is the leader of the Thenns at this time. They are being married together. And it's kind of very interesting because you have this mixed support. It's continually showing how the Night's Watch does not approve of what Jon's doing. Jon is at this time isolating many of the people of the Night's Watch, where at this wedding we see a lot of the Queen's men, because for now they kind of do like what Jon's doing, right? You're uniting a northern house with the wildlings and all those things, but they're not going to have a great relationship in the future. And so a little bit of that is foreshadowed here once again with Axel Florent. But yeah. And then we also see that Jon has almost no support. There's no Night's Watchmen really here whatsoever. And so it's interesting to see how Jon also is kind of playing northern politics. Like he's trying to say, oh yeah, he's not, taking any side or whatnot, but at the same time he is. He's arranging this marriage between Alice and Sigorn, and also he's taking Cregan Stark captive. Now he does have some precedent that he's trying to use. Alice Karstark came to them, and here's Cregan Stark trying to take her against, against her will. That is a crime, but the way people are going to view the situation is they're going to look at it from an outside point of view. You don't have all the information. You're going to say, oh yeah, the Night's Watch is helping Stannis, or it's going against, Cregan Karstark. So I look at all this information and I find that very interesting because, for one, Jon is playing politics that it's kind of working against him, right? People are slowly becoming more and more against him, and he's losing support to do these actions. And we're going to see that kind of falling out in the next couple chapters. But we do see this marriage, and in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like this uneasy, bright moment for this late part of the John storyline, where everything that we're hearing in John's storyline is kind of not good, right? You can tell there's some sort of conflict coming between the wildlings and the Night's Watch, and you kind of feel that boiling over. And so when you have that coming into it, but you also have this marriage, which is kind of a happy marriage, right? Alice seems to at least be happy, trying to get Sigorn to open up, and this interesting alliance. And Alice, just as a character, is very fascinating. I really enjoy the character of Alice. Again, her and John have really good chemistry in these chapters. And so you do have this happy moment in the face of impending doom for John. And it also really boils over when you have Axel Florn once again talking about Val to John when we hear a horn blow to say that Val has returned. So again, this chapter really does a great job of building off of the reveal of the last John chapter and also pushing kind of the story forward and moving us into really the last couple of chapters. John has, I believe, 3 chapters after this. So really good chapter from John. I don't think it's like top 20 or anything like that, but it's definitely a solid one. And number 51, we get into Danny 8. So Danny 8 is really weird because it has the issue of coming right before Danny's really big chapter, which is Danny 9. It's one of the best chapters of the book. And it also doesn't have a lot for Daenerys to really do, right? And so in a lot of ways, I don't feel like this is a bad chapter for Daenerys. But again, it's not a good chapter for Daenerys either. I just think it's very middle of the pack. And so this chapter really follows these Yunkai like peace talks, right? Where Hizdar is entertaining the Yunkish and Daenerys is just kind of sitting back, just observing. It's not a lot that she's doing in this chapter in terms of actions, right? And so a lot of this chapter, it's just kind of, whatever. It's her looking at the Yunkish, flaunting, their slaves and all flaunting things in Daenerys' face, seeing how much she'll take. See if she will maybe break the peace, which she ends up kind of doing in the next chapter, not of her own decisions, but because of Drogon, but still. And so you see, Hizdar playing the king role, Daenerys just allowing it to happen, and Daenerys is kind of just sulking about this. But the best 2 moments of the chapter are definitely when Daenerys is able to actually do something and having conversations with people. And so we see her having a conversation with Brown Ben Plum. And it's interesting because Brown Ben Plum tells her straight up, like, the reason, we went against you is not because we don't like you. It's because, you are looking like you're on the losing side. You're not, being able to control your dragons, which is the thing that's going to make you, you're a conqueror. And so he says those things. And so you can see that, yeah, Brown Ben Plum is somebody that would be open to maybe coming back to Daenerys' side, like Tyrion inevitably, convinces him to do in the next couple of chapters. But at the same time, you can see that Daenerys is going against her Targaryen side, something Quaithe told her to not do. Remember who she is. That's something that she's going to have to realize in Dany 10. And Dany 9, I guess, as well. And then the other part of this chapter is where she basically has Quentyn come with her, and Daenerys is trying to basically nicely say, Quentyn, this is not a good place for you. Daenerys is now married to Hizdar, right? Like, this is not the time for you to be here, and it's very dangerous for you to be here. And she also tries to show the dragons to him to kind of scare him and all those things. And funny enough, Quentyn takes this as, oh yeah, maybe I should release a dragon. The dragons will definitely like me. So again, I like what it does for Daenerys in terms of the last 2 conversations. Really, the back part of this chapter is more of the enjoyable stuff, not the front half. And it also kind of gets the Quentyn plot forwarding, keeping going, and somehow Quentyn rationalizes what he's going to rationalize, and getting kind of his plot for the last parts of this book. But yeah, a pretty solid Daenerys chapter. Has some good, has some bad, like a lot of this book does. Number 52, and we have Theon 7. And so George was just burning through these Theon chapters. I mean, we've only done about 11. This will be the 11th chapter we've done in this video, and he's already burned through 3 of them. So Theon 7, I do want to take a kind of moment here because this is his last chapter of the book in terms of a POV. He will show up in one more chapter, but he is not actually the POV in that chapter. And so Theon, to me, is the reason why Dance with Dragons, I think a lot of people might view it better than I do. Because I think without Theon's plotline, I think this book would be very, 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 very much viewed not as great. Because Theon, to me, is the constant of this book. Every chapter he has is a top 20 chapter in the book. He is fantastic. I think George does some of his best writing in the entire series in this plot line, and he concludes it here. And this chapter is just full of tension, where it's been kind of building up and building up. It explodes here, right? In terms of Theon, his character, in terms of the actual northern plot, it explodes, right? Because you have people on the edge of their seats, right? Because in this chapter, we see that little Walder has been killed, presumably by Big Walder. And you see all that, coming to pass, right? The Manderleys and the Freys are coming to blows. It seems like there's going to be a battle that's going to go out between the two as Wyman Manderley is actually assaulted in this actual chapter. We see that Roose has to send them out to try and kill Stannis, because if he doesn't, there's going to be a battle within Winterfell, and it's not going to be a good look for Roose. And so Roose sends them out. And this is the kind of the catalyst for everything and to go into motion, right? Theon and the Spearwives are going to try and free Jaime. And so this is huge for Theon, because it's going to be him going against Ramsay. And so he has to have courage. He has to do all these things. But we know if he fails at any point, right, whether it's, getting the bathwater, whether it's trying to get past the guards, whether it's trying to get Jane to actually cooperate, if any of these things goes wrong and Theon isn't killed, he's going to experience even worse torture than before. And so you have that playing on this situation where Theon and the Spearwives, they're trying to get past all these obstacles. And we see, Theon becoming Theon once again. That's why this chapter is like Theon 1. And so we see him getting Jane to have some courage and to escape. And the plan just slowly starts to unravel, right? It just slowly starts to go wrong. Having to kill this person, that making a big sound, and not having the rope because the Spearwife that is kind of holding her ground, well, she had the rope to get down, so now you're just gonna have to jump for it. And so you see Theon and Jane escaping Winterfell in this last-ditch attempt where it's like, okay, if we die in the fall, that's better than living. So it's Theon taking this arc where we start the journey with him as Reek, as this character that has almost no part of Theon left in him. And by the end of it, through this transformation of a character, finding this new version of Theon, it is one of the best character arcs in terms of just a single book in the entire story. It is my second favorite chapter and or best chapter of the book. I still have Davos 4 ahead of it, but it is ranked number 2 for me. Theon, like I talked about, is a character that I don't rank outside of the top 30 chapters. The lowest one I have is Theon 1, which is number 28, and that's the Reek chapter, not actually like Theon 1 as it is in the book. I know it might be a little confusing, but yeah. So Theon 7, fantastic chapter. I got to give George all of his flowers for what he did with the character in this book, and it's a shame we won't see him really in the last 20-ish chapters of the book outside of just Asha. But yeah. So getting into chapter 53, and like I just talked about, Theon's last chapter of the book for me is the second best chapter. And right after we get through with that chapter, right, one of the best of the book, I think for most of the people in the community, George follows it up by giving us Dany 9. And like I talk about, no matter what book we are in, if Dany has a POV in it, she has just one banger chapter every single book. Game of Thrones, her last chapter, the ending of Game of Thrones, is, in my opinion, the best chapter of the entire book. It's up there as one of the best of the entire series. Book 2, The House of the Undying, one of the best of the book, one of the best of the series. Storm of Swords, you could say a lot of different chapters are really good for her. Personally, the one that always sticks to me is when she does get the Unsullied, one of the best chapters of that book. And then you get to book 5. And book 5, Dany is kind of in this weird place, because when we do my chapter rankings at the end of this series, you're going to see a lot of Daenerys' chapters are kind of in the same area. They're kind of just kind of in that middle ground of this book. But Dany comes swinging in Dany 9. I think this is probably, I have it ranked as of right now as the 6th best chapter of the book. And this is the chapter where Daenerys finally rides Drogon. It's been this big thing we've been waiting for from Daenerys for a long time. She having to remember who she is, being a Targaryen, and pushing back on everything the Yunkish have been doing to her. And so there's that part of it, right? That is the climax of this chapter. But before we get to that part, it's the reopening of the fighting pits. Dany has to be here just for the customs, and she's required to be here and all of that. And so I even like how Daenerys is forced to, again, building off the last chapter, she feels awful that she has to watch this violence, right? That's pointless to her. Now, we know why some of these people might want this for glory, gold, all those type of things, but for Dany, she views it as violence that is just pointless. It doesn't do anything that is good in her eyes. We see a number of interesting things happen as there's an assassination attempt on her life, it would appear, but thankfully for her, Strong Belwys eats all of the locusts, and he's just that much of a Chad that he actually is going to live. But so we have that mystery. We still haven't solved that mystery going into Winds of Winter, and it's something we still speculate on till today. And to me, I still don't have a really concrete answer into what actually occurred there. I think it could likely be somebody like Resnack. It could be somebody, maybe it is like his daughter, but I don't really like that idea. It seems like too on the nose for George. Maybe it was the Green Grace. Maybe it was somebody in the Yunkish. Who knows? Could have been Skahaz, the Shave Pate. There's a number of people that would have wanted Dany dead. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about as you reread these chapters. And one thing that I specifically was looking towards, and it's kind of a video I already did, but the idea of who this perfumed individual that is going to betray Daenerys is something I kind of tried to think about. And it's just hard because in Meereen, there's just so many different people that would want her dead and just don't like her based upon how she's ruling Meereen, that it's going to be interesting to see the way George kind of connects all these plots and finishes them. But we also see a fight with a boar in which the boar wins. But at this, because of all the bloodshed and all the commotion, Drogon comes in and eats the boar. Now, I think this is interesting because if you guys remember, back in book 1, Robert Baratheon is killed by a boar. And so I find it interesting because you think about, after Robert's death, we've had this fight for who should be the heir after him, right? And so it's been Joffrey, Tommen, Stannis, Renly, all these different people. And I almost think this is somewhat of some symbolism, right? That Daenerys is going to come in and she's going to be the one that's going to basically destroy all these other claimants to the throne. And when she takes over, referencing, her eating the boar. I just think that's a nice little tie-in, referring to Robert Baratheon, the one that took down her family, the thing that killed her, and then Daenerys' dragon eats a boar. I just find that a little nice symbolism, something I didn't pick up on in past rereads. But this all leads to Drogon landing in the pits, and one of the most tense moments in the book. Everything seems to freeze in time as Daenerys goes towards Drogon, trying to command him and to really, get that connection that we see, for instance, in like House of the Dragon, to be able to ride him. A very similar thing to like maybe, Aemond with Vhagar in House of the Dragon or something like that. Maybe Laena with Vhagar is another, maybe good example as well. And we see that Daenerys is finally able to ride Drogon and claim her dragon for the most part. And at this, she ends up flying off. And again, this is something as a book fan that you would have been waiting for a long time. Ever since that we knew that dragons were going to be a thing in this series when they were brought to, I guess, the world or to Daenerys in book 1 at the very end, this is something we were always waiting for. And something that's going to be really interesting is how George then, uses the other 2 dragons, right? Because we've never really seen somebody that's able to, have a claim on 3 dragons, right? Daenerys is the mother of these 3 dragons, but it seems likely that Daenerys's like mental connection just is not as strong with those other 2 dragons. And so who eventually is going to tame those dragons, right? People have put forth this idea of maybe this dragon tamer theory. Maybe it's going to be, Euron. Maybe somehow Victarion gets a dragon. Maybe young Griff. Maybe, Brown Ben Plum. Maybe Jon Snow. There's just so many people that have Targaryen blood that possibly could still claim a dragon, that it'll be interesting to see how George does it. Daenerys 9 is a chapter that I think was sorely needed in this book because, in my opinion, Daenerys doesn't have a lot of chapters that, to me, stick out. That, if you didn't reread the series and you're, 5 or 10 years removed from reading this book, there's not many moments that I think really stick out for Daenerys outside of, I'd say, probably this chapter, the next chapter, and maybe some of the just things going on politically that you see with Daenerys. But I do think this book is not her worst book. I think Clash is definitely her worst book, but this is definitely kind of just on her. It's not as good as Game of Thrones, not as good as The Storm of Swords, but this chapter definitely helps. And that'll get us to number 54, Jon 11. So Jon 11, again, kind of a switch of pace, right? We come from 2 of the most tense and best chapters of the book down to Jon 11, which, it's fine. I think it has some good things about it. I think it has some things where it's like, has to get done, but it's not the most exciting stuff. So for instance, the beginning of this, chapter is all about Tormund and how they're going to negotiate the wildlings, coming south and crossing, crossing south of the wall. And part of those terms are, having to give up hostages, giving their treasures to the wall to pay for food, and where they shall actually live once they are established south of the wall. Eventually, all this is figured out. Tormund agrees, and Val and Jon must tell Selyse of the terms. And she's not very happy about this because they're not really, keeping to Stannis the way he had done it in the past, right? Where they had to kneel to him and all those things. And so these wildlings are not going to be forced to do that at all. And so Selyse isn't happy with this. She's also not happy the way Val has been kind of, set free and being not forced to marry some of her own knights or whatnot. And so when you see this occurring, it basically isolates Jon even more, because when we saw in Jon 10 was, Jon was losing support from the Night's Watch, but he at least still seemed to have some support, from the Queen's men, right? At least that they were, happy with the Alice Karstark marriage. And so now at this point where, you have this Jon kind of severing those ties with Selyse, it's like at this point at Jon 11, who really does Jon have backing him up? And when you think about that question, you go, there really isn't anybody that like you would think is a staunch ally right now of Jon's, outside of maybe people like Val, Mel, maybe Tormund, Dolores Ed, but he's not even really currently at the Night's Watch. He's, at another castle at this point they're trying to repair. So Jon is very isolated, and that becomes very apparent in this chapter. We also get some interesting stuff about Val and the way she views Shireen and Patchface as a whole, saying the child is cursed and that she should be killed and things like that. It'll be interesting to see if that plays a part in Shireen's death, because it does seem like Stannis is going to burn Shireen. Will that have some, effect? Will Shireen cause, this grayscale plague type situation? Very interesting foreshadowing in this chapter about that. We just don't know fully where that's going to go yet. But this kind of leads to, in my opinion, the moment when I think Bowen Marsh and a lot of the other leaders begin plotting Jon's demise. Because when Jon tells them that he's going to let the wildlings south of the wall, for them, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because all these issues kind of come to the forefront, right? Where you have it like, how are we going to feed them? How do we trust them to not kill us, right? They have way more people than we do. The only thing that gave us any advantage over the wildlings was the wall. So what are we going to do when we have all these wildlings south of the wall? What if one day we have a scuttle or some sort of disagreement and they kill us? And it's again, this issue that I think it's interesting that George places this chapter, after we get a Jaime chapter, where we basically have this whole thing where it's generations of violence and hatred. It's the same thing here with the wildlings and the Night's Watch. It's like telling the Blackwoods and the Brackens, yeah, you're going to, go in one castle and you're going to work together. It just wouldn't work more than likely unless you really sat down people and figured this all out. And so we can understand Jon's rationale as to why he decides to bring the wildlings south of the wall, because of course they're all going to die. If they stay north of the wall, they're going to be killed by the others. It's going to add to the others' army and all those things. So we can understand Jon's rationale. But the problem is Jon doesn't necessarily explain those things that well to them. He doesn't really make them at least understand or accept what this whole thing's going to go down, right? Like that is my biggest issue. I've talked about it with Jon throughout this retrospective, is that the biggest key issue that Jon has is he's not an effective communicator, and I'd almost say he's not an effective leader at times. He is somebody that I think has a lot to learn, especially with how to lead men. And that kind of leads us to the end of the chapter where Bowen Marsh straight up tells Jon that he believes he's breaking his vows. This should be a huge red flag. If you're Jon and you have one of your, main leaders in Bowen Marsh telling you, and a lot of the other leaders agree to this, that he's breaking his vows, what does that say for the people that aren't even leaders? Let's say you're a common builder, or you're, a ranger or whatever. You're not even going to have the insight of what these people do. Like Bowen Marsh, they don't even understand what Jon's doing. How about some just random, peasant that's just recently come to the Night's Watch? You're going to be thinking, what is this guy doing? And he's not explaining it. He's not giving any speeches. He's not explaining to the vast majority of people here what they're doing. And so Jon, I just think, makes another mistake in the way that he executes what he's trying to do. But that'll get us to number 55, Cersei 1. And like I talked about with Arya and a lot of the other POVs that have come over from Feast for Crows, I think distinctively when I remember first rereading Dance and Feast, or reading them for the first time, Cersei 1 and Cersei 2, I both have as top 15 chapters of this book. And I would argue that Cersei 1 and Cersei 2 are two of the best Cersei chapters that we ever get in the series. And so saying that, it's like, okay, how do I look at Feast for Crows? Because I think at Feast for Crows, Cersei's plotline is still good. But man, having these two chapters be in Dance and not Feast, really, like, it just hurts Feast as an overall, because Cersei is concluded as this whole arc in Dance and not Feast for Crows. Like, Feast for Crows, it still works. She gets captured by the Faith and all that stuff. But here we see, like, what her actual conclusion should be. Her breaking down as a character, her going through this traumatic experience of the Walk of Atonement and all that stuff. But let's talk about this chapter specifically. So, again, picking up from where we left off, Cersei has been taken hostage by the Faith Militant and the High Sparrow. And so slowly we see her start to whittle away, beginning as her normal kind of asshole, like, self, more or less. And we see her slowly break down as she's being put through psychological and physical torture, right? They're not letting her sleep. Every hour they come in asking for her to, or telling her really to confess. And it's Cersei, trying to understand, like, how much can she endure? And, when you go from Cersei 1 of Feast for Crows to this, where, you see Cersei basically trying to drink any type of water she can just off of the ground. It's Cersei been taken to her lowest. And in a way, Cersei is a character that we should all dislike, right? Because, she's a character that was behind, Ned losing in Game of Thrones, and she's done, all sorts of horrible things, like getting Tyrion falsely accused and almost killed, and that leading to Tywin's death, all this different stuff, and the way she was to Tyrion, for instance, when she was younger. But when you see Cersei reduced to this, level of torture, and you can't help but feel bad for her, and especially in the next chapter, I'd say specifically. But we see that Cersei still has some of her cunning left. She's somebody that is, still has an ability to maybe charm people or to lie to people, right? And so we see her navigating through the High Sparrow's accusations. Now, unfortunately for her, the High Sparrow is not going to just let her go, right? Because Cersei says some things, yes, I did this, like fornication, sleeping out of wedlock. I did those type of things, slept with Lancel, all those type of things. But there's other charges that she has placed on her, right? The killing of the king and things like that. And so it's Cersei realizing realistically that she doesn't have a way out, right? Kevin Lannister, who comes to tell her later in this chapter as well. It's interesting seeing them meet again, because you think about the last time they were with each other, Cersei basically threw wine in his face. So, and shift of roles here, where Kevin has all the power and Cersei has none. And Kevin even tells her the situation. It's not very good. There's sellswords landing. There's Myrcella's ear has been cut off, and Aerys's death, Jaime's disappearance. Cersei now knows what she has to do. She must make a walk of atonement. It is the only way forward. And it's a perfect continuation off of what we got in Feast for Crows with Cersei. And so this character that, was so prideful, now she's brought to this, where she's so desperate that she's willing to, go naked through the streets of King's Landing. It is a tough thing that's being asked of Cersei, but you can't say that she doesn't deserve it, at least, based on the actions that she's done. But it's almost like, and the show, I think, did this really well. I think Cersei is a character that was, for the most part, done pretty well until the later seasons, like season 7 and 8, in my opinion. Like season 6, still a great character. Is that George gets us to hate the High Sparrow and the Faith Militant and the Faith more than we do Cersei. It's more of a lesser evil type situation. And I know that's probably maybe not for everybody, but I just really enjoy the way George crafts Cersei, especially in this chapter and especially the next chapter. But not only do we get Cersei 1, right? George just keeps kind of spitting, right? George is where, again, Dance, when it hits like around the late 40s to 50 chapters and beyond, this is a very strong end to a book. It just has a ton of great POVs that we get to see the conclusions of. And I know Dance isn't a finished book, really. Like, it does feel like certain things end very weirdly. Like, I would say the North plot line, I think the natural endpoint of where this book should have been would have been the Battle of Ice, and we're not going to see that till Winds of Winter. The Battle of Fire probably should have happened in this book. A lot of that comes down to there just wasn't enough pages and time to do those things. But I really enjoy, some of these POVs later in the book. Now, Barristan 1. So getting Barry the Bold as a POV character is something I never expected reading the books, getting up to this point of the story. And it's a really nice surprise because Barristan really reminds me of Ned. They're very similar characters. Even when you read Barristan, he seems to be on like Ned's side, for instance, and in terms of policies and stuff like that in Game of Thrones. And so I really love Barristan trying to navigate this Marinese plotline, this political situation, because even Daenerys struggles with that a ton. And Daenerys is a much better, I would say, politician than someone like Barristan. Barristan tries his best, but we see the situation after Daenerys has left, where Hizdahr has been making a lot of questionable decisions. It seems like he's getting very buddy-buddy with the Yunkish and the Slavers. He's also putting away all of Daenerys' support. Everyone that was here that was in positions of power before have been stripped of that power. Skahaz, the Shave Pate, has been displaced at this time. Barristan is kind of the last person to get displaced, but all of Daenerys' staunchest allies like Strong Belwys is gone. Missandei, she's not here to announce Hizdahr. All of the people that were kind of supporting, Daenerys are gone, or they're at least not gone, I guess, but they're not in power anymore. And so we see Hizdahr kind of solidifying his power, putting people he trusts behind him. Now, another thing I think is interesting, you think about this is, okay, like I just talked about, everybody from, Daenerys' former councils and people that she trusted are gone, except Reznak. Someone that obviously went against Daenerys in multiple policies. I did a whole video basically on Reznak as a character. In that video I did 2 weeks ago, I believe. But yeah, I just find it very interesting to see how Barristan goes about doing all these things. As we see people thinking that Daenerys may have left them or even is dead, as there's been multiple rumors going on. But at this time, we see a meeting between Skahaz and Barristan. And it feels very Ned and Littlefinger. Like, Skahaz almost seems to be taunting Barristan at multiple times, suggesting maybe Barristan will be a slave at one point and all these things. And, we see Skahaz's point of view, and Barristan is really back into the situation where all of the evidence does seem to, prove that Hizdahr should not be on the throne. He's been making some sketchy things going on. But the problem is, and the issue that Barristan's going to face, in my opinion, is who really can you trust? You definitely can't trust the Skahaz, the Shave Pate, which Barristan doesn't, but you also can't really trust Reznak and also Hizdahr either. So you're left in the situation where Barristan kind of takes power off the back of both the Unsullied and Skahaz. And so we see that all playing out. Now that's going to play out in, a future chapter, but I really love the introduction of Barristan. I think the knowledge that he has, one of the reasons I'm a big proponent for Barristan not dying at the very beginning of the next book is because we can learn so much through him. If George wants to expand the War of the Nine Penny Kings or expanding, the reigns of Targaryen kings that Barristan was serving under, Barristan's the perfect character to do that. And so I love Barristan. Hope we get more of him in Winds of Winter. But yeah, that gets us to number 57, the last one that we're going to talk about in this part. And we'll have one last part, which will finish which will finish the book for us. And that I will say probably won't be out until probably January, as I'm going to have a Christmas event, as you guys should know. If you're new to the channel, I do have a Christmas event where I daily upload for the first 25 days of December. But yeah, we won't actually finish this series probably until January, February time. But yeah. So getting into the last chapter of today's video, number 57, Victarion 1. Again, Victarion, our lovable, bloodthirsty, idiot Greyjoy. I can't help but say I really had fun reading his chapters in The Dance with Dragons. There's a lot of chapters I didn't really have that much fun with reading. Like, for instance, a lot of Tyrion and Quentyn chapters, come to mind, or even some of Daenerys's lower end chapters. But Victarion is just a fun character to read. He's not the best POV of this book. He's not even close to that, in my opinion, but it's just fun to read the way his mind works, right? We see how the crossing has worked, as it's been pretty costly. Victarion currently is at the Isle of Cedars with less than half the fleet that had left the Reach. He's kind of in a sticky situation, right? Because he traveled all this way to Essos, and now he's lost about half of his fleet, but he can't wait any longer. The slavers are going for Meereen and taking down Daenerys. He's even more worried because when they stopped in Volantis, he saw the ships. There was anywhere from 300 to 500 ships, which dwarfs the size of Victarion's fleet, even though Victarion's are probably better manned and all that stuff. But Victarion doesn't have the strength to rival them. But we also saw something else is bothering Victarion, as his hand has continued to fester and it seems infected. And the maesters, they've tried, or at least the maester that he has and it was given by Euron, hasn't helped whatsoever. And so Victarion kills him. As in this chapter, we also find Maquaro, who we haven't seen from Tyrion when they were back on the ship together. Maquaro does some quite interesting things here, because when Maquaro tries to heal Victarion's hand, we don't see what happens inside, but it does sound a lot like Mirri Maz Duur's like ceremony with Drogo in the tent back in book 1 with Dany, because it seems like there's shadows dancing and all these things. And when Victarion comes out, he has this almost black, charred looking arm or hand, but it seems more powerful. And it seems very interesting. Maquaro must have used some sort of fire magic and or I assume maybe blood magic. And so Victarion gets rid of the Maester. And this is how we kind of end Victarion 1, but I really think Victarion 1's a fun chapter. It's not the best chapter or anything, but I hope you guys have all enjoyed. I know this series does not get the most amount of views on my channel, but for the people that do watch it, I hope you guys really enjoy it. I put a lot of work into this series, and I hope you guys all enjoyed. I'll see you guys all in the next part. Again, probably won't be until January, and then we'll probably finish up with like my big overall retrospective, which will probably be, again, all these parts put together, plus my conclusion, my rankings of the POVs and chapters, all of that stuff. But I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.